Today, I've put together 5 morgue horror stories that prove one thing. Even in the quietest routine, there's always something waiting to slip out of control. And you'll feel that right away in the first story, where a mortician comes back late at night after hearing whispers coming from under the table, from a dead body he forgot to embalm. Before we start, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a terrifying story. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I always say the problem isn't the dead. The problem is when you let something slip, even the smallest detail, because that's when your mind starts working against you. And that night, man, I let slip the one thing I always avoid. To this day, I remember the exact feeling of leaving something open, like I'd left a door cracked just enough for something to slip through without asking. My shift had been brutal. 2 late afternoon services, a complicated prep, and the phone ringing non-stop because of an early funeral. By the time I finally got a breath, it was well past midnight. The prep room was cold, just like it needed to be. That smell of formaldehyde mixed with disinfectant and damp metal in the air. All I wanted was to go home. That's when I messed up. I left Mr. Elias's body on table 2, unembalmed, thinking I'd handle it in the morning. I never do that. Never. But exhaustion makes you believe tomorrow will be easier. I got home with that uneasy feeling. It wasn't guilt yet, more like a hunch. I lay down, closed my eyes, and in that instant something in me locked up. It felt like someone was tapping my shoulder, but only in my memory, like part of my brain had stayed back at the funeral home. The thought hit me hard. You left something open. And it wasn't just half-finished work. It was a break in routine, something I always avoid touching. I tried to ignore it, but the more I breathed, the stronger the feeling of being watched, even in my own bedroom. It wasn't a clear spiritual presence, no visions, nothing like that. Just that weight at the back of my neck, the kind you get in supernatural experiences when you're still trying to convince yourself it's all in your head. It didn't even last 10 minutes. I got up, changed, and drove back to the funeral home before sunrise, gripped by that mix of irritation and silly fear you don't want to admit to. The parking lot was empty, the street still dark. The white lights of the building flickered on as I badged in, and the moment I opened the prep room door, the cold hit my face like a warning. Not the usual refrigerated chill. This was the kind that burns your skin, like the air had gone too still. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Fluorescent lights buzzing softly, instruments lined up, drawers closed. Only table 2 stood out. Mr. Elias's body was still there, covered to the chest with the blue sheet. Everything normal. But I took 2 steps inside, and I heard it. Right under the table. A low, muffled murmur dragging on. No words, just the sound of someone talking to themselves, the way you do when you don't want anyone to hear. I froze, eyes locked on that table. I swear I thought about turning around, but you know how it is. When you work with death and heavy routines, you learn not to let panic take over. So I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize it. Must be trapped air, must be the pipes. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, but it didn't stick. There were no pipes under that part of the room. Nothing there that could make that sound. Still, I moved forward. I turned on the extra lamp, rolled over the instrument cart, and started the prep, focusing on the technical, checking arteries, massaging pressure points, preparing the fluids. As I worked, my mind kept searching for explanations. Bodies sometimes release gas. They can make popping sounds. Even that weird noise of air escaping the throat. I've seen it all, but nobody whispers under a metal table at 5 in the morning. The problem was, the sound didn't stop. It faded, then grew a little louder, then faded again. Repetitive, like someone was insisting on calling me without raising their voice. And it was coming from one spot, right in the center of the base of table 2. It couldn't be the body. The body was on the table. The voice was coming from under it. I looked down once, just once, and I never repeated that movement in any other late-night shift. You know that feeling when you want to see, but your body has already decided it's better to pretend you didn't hear? That's exactly what happened. My mind forced normalcy, like it was just another shift with weird happenings I could chalk up to exhaustion. But one thing stuck with me. The moment I started the process, right as I began perfusing the first fluid, the sound stopped. Like whatever it was had realized I was doing what I should have done the night before. Total silence. Thick. All I could hear was my breathing and the faint click of the instruments. I still believe that was a response. I don't know from who. I don't know from what. All I know is the second the process really began, the murmurs vanished. The room went still, but in a way that felt almost satisfied. And honestly, that's the kind of thought I never admit out loud at work. The rest of the procedure went normally. Mr. Elias's body showed no strange changes beyond natural rigor. I finished up, cleaned the table, disposed of the materials. That uncomfortable silence lingered, but the air had a different weight, like the tension had passed, leaving only residue. That feeling of being watched slowly faded, until it was just a forgettable alert in the back of my mind. Before leaving, I forced myself to do what I always do. Documentation. It's almost a ritual for me. I logged the times, the condition of the body, the procedure, everything by the book. And in the observations field, which is usually blank, I wrote the only thing my brain could come up with without sounding absurd. Returned early due to perceived auditory irregularity in the room. If anyone reads that in the future, they'll think I heard a beep or an electrical hum. And that's fine. I prefer it that way. The rest of the day went normally, but the feeling didn't fully fade. I carried it with me for weeks. That impression that my mistake had opened a space for something to manifest, if only for a few minutes. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. Or maybe it was something else. The kind of thing they don't teach in mortuary school. I never left a body unpreserved overnight again. Not even for 10 minutes. And every time someone asks if I've ever had a supernatural experience at work, I think of that night. I don't tell them everything, of course. I just say that in this line of work, following protocol isn't just about keeping order. It's about keeping boundaries. It's about protecting us. And sometimes it's even about protecting those who've already gone. Creepy, right? What did you think of that story? Rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments below. Hearing whispers would already be enough to freak anyone out, but things get way more personal inside funeral homes. Like in the next story, where the dead decide to call the mortician by name. I still remember the exact moment I heard my own name coming from a dead man's mouth. It wasn't the whisper of pipes, not that hiss of air that sometimes tricks you. It was my voice, and to make it worse, it came straight from the lips of a man I had just prepared with the utmost care. Even now, every time I think about it, I feel that same eerie sensation of being watched that gripped me in the early hours of that morning. The day had started strange. Rain threatened to fall at any moment, that heavy, damp air that makes everything feel clammy, and I already knew it could make things harder for the family during the final identification. So I did what I always do when the clouds look too heavy. I set aside a towel and covered the windshield of their car before they even arrived. It's a small detail, but I've learned that in moments like these, any gesture can ease the tension, and in this case, Henry's family was hanging by a thread. His wife, Martha, seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She moved slowly, hands buried in her coat, eyes glistening with that wet sheen of someone who's been holding back tears since dawn. She didn't want makeup for her husband, no embellishments. She just asked that he be prepared the way she remembered him before the illness. I understood. Some families want the body almost theatrical, staged. Others prefer the honesty of goodbye. Hers was the latter. So I took my time. I wiped his face gently with a damp cloth, carefully closed his mouth, combed his hair the way I imagined Martha would like. The scent of disinfectant rose slowly, mingling with the faint, lingering smell of wilted flowers that always hung in the identification room. The light in there is soft, almost yellow, like someone trying to mimic the feeling of late afternoon. And even though I'd done this hundreds of times, that atmosphere always got to me. It was too quiet, as if every object was waiting for the exact moment to become part of the scene. When everything was ready, I let Martha know. She entered slowly, almost dragging her feet, and stopped beside the body. She didn't touch him right away. She just looked, the kind of look that searches for life where there's nothing left but memory. After a few seconds, she asked for a moment alone. I just nodded and left. I stood outside, leaning against the cold wall, listening to her murmurs. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell she was talking to him as if he could hear. And honestly, who was I to say he couldn't? I gave her all the time she needed. When she came out, wiping her face with the back of her hand, she gave me a shy nod of thanks. I told her I was going to adjust the gurney before taking Henry to the chapel. It was simple: lock the wheels, adjust the height, check the sheet. Routine, technical procedure. There was no room for surprises, strange occurrences, or supernatural experiences. It was just supposed to be another step in the process. But that's when everything began. I leaned down to adjust the side lock and heard someone call my name. Jack. Sharp. Just like that. But it wasn't just any voice. It was mine. The tone. The way I speak. That quick, clipped way I have when I'm focused. It was me. And it came from the right, just inches from where I stood. There was only one person in that direction. Henry. I froze. I couldn't respond, couldn't turn my head. My mind scrambled for any logical explanation. A burst of air? No, impossible. His chest was still. It wasn't the creak of furniture or an echo from the hallway. The room was too quiet for that. The only thing moving was my own heart, pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape something I didn't yet understand. The voice repeated softer but still clear. Jack. This time I turned. Not fast, but as quickly as my body would allow when fear had turned my muscles rigid. And Henry, of course, hadn't moved. His face was exactly as I'd left it. Mouth closed, eyes shut. No twitch, no tremor. Just that neutral, tired expression of someone who had spent too long fighting a body that no longer obeyed. A wave of heat rushed from the back of my neck to my shoulders, and for a second I thought I might pass out. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched that had filled the room. It was as if something in there was studying me, trying to understand why I was still so close. And at the same time, it felt like it was waiting for a reaction from me. But I didn't have a decent reaction to give. I closed my eyes for a second and tried to pull myself together. It's just your imagination, I thought. Fatigue, long night, internal noise, anything. But it didn't help. The experience had been too clear. And it was even worse because it was my own voice. If it had been someone else's, maybe I could have chalked it up to an echo, interference, auditory memory. But mine? From the body of a dead man who had never heard me say more than the basics. I only managed to go back to adjusting the gurney after a few seconds. My hands trembled slightly, but I did my best to stay in control. In this line of work, you learn to hide fear better than most people in the world. It's not courage, it's practice. But that day, not even all the practice in the world could stop the cold that crept down my spine. I took Henry to the chapel. Martha was already there, sitting in the front pew, fingers interlaced. When she looked at him, she let out a soft sigh, almost as if she'd found some peace in his face. I watched from a distance, letting her have that final moment with her husband without rush, without interruption. No matter how strange what had happened to me was, I didn't want anything to interfere with her time. After it was all over, I helped the family with what they needed and said goodbye. The rain finally started to fall as they left, and I was glad I'd covered their car earlier. Small details make a difference when someone's heart is already shattered. I went back to the prep room later, the lights off, the sound of rain tapping on the roof. I caught myself thinking again about what had happened. It wasn't something I could talk about with colleagues, not without becoming a joke or having the story twisted. So I kept it to myself. I just allowed myself to accept that some things don't need answers. There are mysteries that only ask for silence. A few days later, I found a small envelope left at the front desk. It was from Martha. Inside was a card thanking me for the care, the patience, for treating her husband with dignity. At the end, she wrote something that sent a chill through me again. Henry always liked the name Jack. He always said it was a name that inspired trust. I read that line 5 times. How did he like the name? I'd never told him my name. He arrived unconscious. The family was the only one who knew who I was in there. So how? I kept the card in a drawer where I only store things that marked my professional life. It's still there. Every time I open it, I remember the voice coming from the body, motionless. I remember the rain, the dim light in the room, the calm before that inexplicable moment. And I remember most of all the lesson this job taught me that day. We're not always here to understand. Sometimes we're just here to honor. The truth is, every morgue has its own secrets. Some hide in the silence. Others reveal themselves without asking. And that day, Henry left me with the kind of memory that doesn't take up space but weighs heavy, as if it had been placed on my shoulders. A man who no longer breathed, calling my name in my own voice. I never heard anything like it again. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the identification room adjusting a gurney, I still feel that same tension in the air. As if the world wants to remind me that not everything in there is just technique. There are things we do with our hands, and things we have to accept with our hearts. And Henry made that clear in the strangest way possible. Horrifying, isn't it? After that final goodbye, it becomes clear that some farewells are anything but simple, and some bodies refuse to hide that fact, like in this next story, where a smile just wouldn't disappear. I was alone in the prep room near the end of my shift when I noticed that smile had come back again. It wasn't some big, dramatic grin, nothing like you'd see in a movie. It was subtle, almost polite. The kind of smile that shouldn't have been there after everything I'd already done to his face. You know how it is. Working in a morgue, you see strange things that don't make sense. But this one felt different. Personal, almost. The deceased was Alfred, 78 years old, passed peacefully in his sleep at the nursing home where he'd lived for years. His family wanted a simple wake, open casket, nothing over the top. When he arrived, I noticed right away how relaxed his expression was, like he'd just settled in after a long day. That's not unusual for natural deaths, but for the wake, that smile needed softening. Funeral home policy, neutral expression, no hint of joy or pain. I was so used to making these adjustments that I started the process without thinking much about it. But after I fixed the smile, I took one last quick look before leaving the room. And there it was again. The corners of his mouth had lifted just slightly. Nothing drastic, nothing absurd, just off. I figured I'd messed up the adjustment, so I corrected it again. Everything seemed fine. I moved on to embalming, which was the priority. Alfred's file showed he'd been on a lot of medications, so I had to reinforce the drainage, be extra careful with the arterial fluid distribution, and do that meticulous work that makes the skin look natural. All the while, I kept glancing at his face, almost on instinct, and his mouth was neutral, exactly as it should be. I closed the casket to move him to the chapel, took care of a few other things, and left the surveillance camera recording, like I always do when I'm alone in the room. It's more of a safety habit than anything else. When I came back a couple of hours later, I'd already turned off the lights and was heading out, but something nagged at me. That feeling of being watched, like I needed to check his face one more time. You develop a weird kind of intuition in this line of work. I went back to the casket, opened it slowly, and there it was, the smile again. Just like the first time. Soft, gentle, like someone remembering something good. I swear I just stood there staring, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Muscle retraction. Had I pulled the skin unevenly? I've seen a lot after death. Skin stiffening too fast, eyes that won't stay closed, jaws locking up. But this movement, no. It didn't feel natural. It felt almost intentional. But I was exhausted, and exhaustion makes you imagine things. So I redid the adjustment, carefully, double-checking every step. I use techniques I only break out when the body needs to look flawless. Cotton fixation, reinforcing the facial muscles, careful molding. One thing was certain, neutral mouth, no smile, and it was perfect. Or at least I thought it was. In the early hours of the morning, while the overnight staff kept the chapel closed, I decided to review the camera footage. I can't explain why. Maybe it was pure curiosity. Maybe it was that unsettling feeling that something was slipping past me. When I pulled up the recording, I had to lean in. The movement was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was there. First, the left corner of his mouth relaxed. Then the right. Slowly, like someone inside was pushing his face back to its original expression. It wasn't fast, wasn't scary. It was insistent. And that made it all the more unsettling. Because it didn't make sense. Dead muscles don't work like that. They don't have a mind of their own. I sat there watching and re-watching the clip. The camera was clear, no interference. Nothing to explain that movement. This wasn't like the usual scares I'd had in this place. It wasn't about fear. It was about identity. There was something there that seemed to say, "Don't touch that. That's how I lived." The next day, the family arrived. Simple, quiet people, the kind who've dealt with loss before. The eldest daughter approached first and looked at her father with affection. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. Wow, he always used to smile like that when he slept. It's so good to see him like this. He looks like he's finally at peace. My stomach twisted, not from fear, but from a strange mix of emotion and discomfort. In that moment, everything clicked. I'd spent hours trying to erase something that was part of him, something his body insisted on keeping even after death. Like that habit was stronger than any technique I could use. It hit me hard, because it reminded me that every person who comes to me carries a whole life with them, and sometimes those lives show up in the details, the way their hands rest, the lines on their face, the stubborn smile. The family stayed a while, talking softly, sharing memories, gently touching his arm. Watching them, the smile didn't seem strange anymore. It became part of him, part of the memory they held, something that represented who Alfred was when he was still alive. I decided not to touch it again. I accepted that this would be his final gesture, a kind of goodbye. When the wake ended and everyone left, I went back to the surveillance room and saved the overnight footage. Not to show anyone, not to prove anything. I saved it because it taught me something I always forget. Death doesn't erase who someone was. Some might call it residual energy, others a strange phenomenon. But to me it was clear, even in stillness, the body holds on to a piece of identity. I watched the video one last time before leaving. Under no circumstances did the movement seem random. It was slow, almost tender, like someone adjusting their face on a pillow before sleep. Watching it, I found myself smiling too, almost without meaning to. Not because it was beautiful or poetic, but because I realized I'd been trying to control something that never needed controlling. I still keep that footage on a flash drive, hidden away. Not because I'm afraid, but because it reminds me there are things I can't explain. And honestly, maybe that's for the best. Some expressions aren't meant to be erased. Sometimes a person's last gesture is exactly what they want to leave behind. And in that quiet early morning, I was certain Alfred's smile wasn't just a muscle reflex. It was a small memory, refusing to fade. A peaceful way to say goodbye, even after everything had stopped. Bizarre, right? If a smile keeps coming back on its own, that's already disturbing. But imagine discovering something essential is missing inside a body. The next story begins right when they notice the heart is gone. But before we continue, if you're still here, hit that like button so YouTube knows you enjoy this kind of content. When I started that shift, I could already tell the prep room air was colder than usual, like the cooling system had cranked up on purpose. The sharp smell of disinfectant filled the hallway, and the constant hum of the embalming machine echoed from the back. That sound you learn to tune out but still gives you the creeping feeling that something's running on its own. My routine was nothing out of the ordinary. Review documents, double-check the paperwork, sort the sterilized supplies, and confirm the ID of the body I'd be preparing that night. It was technical, methodical, almost mechanical work, but heavy with emotional weight, because any mistake we make becomes someone's family's pain. The man that night was named Ernest, mid-60s, natural causes. Everything in the reports looked standard. His family had called twice that day, asking if he'd look whole and presentable. That kind of question always put me on edge. When people insist on it, it's a sign the viewing is going to be emotionally brutal. So I laid out my tools, checked the records, and started the process like always. Inspecting the skin, cleaning, verifying surgical incisions, then opening the cavity. The step that, for me, was always the most critical. A lot of people think the hard part is moving the bodies, but the real delicacy is working inside, where every detail demands your full attention. When I positioned the light over the chest and reached into the open cavity, something felt off. My hand slid through empty space where I expected resistance. I pressed gently, trying to locate the heart by texture, but there was nothing. Just cold, hollow silence. Like someone had taken the organ and left the rest behind, assuming I wouldn't notice. I pulled the light back, took a deep breath, and mentally ran through every document. Nothing mentioned organ removal. Nothing justified this. That's when the first wave of unease hit me. That mix of alarm and dread, like I was being watched from behind, even though I knew the room was empty. I stopped everything right then. I couldn't proceed without understanding what had happened. In a morgue, where the unexpected is part of the job, a missing heart is a serious problem. Not just technically, but morally, emotionally, legally. I pulled off my gloves, grabbed the phone, and called the medical examiner directly. He only took calls in the middle of the night if the situation was critical. I explained what was going on, and he went silent for a few seconds, which only ratcheted up my tension. Then he let out a heavy sigh and said he might know why. According to him, an intern on the afternoon shift had removed the heart for analysis but forgot to update the records. To me, that wasn't just forgetfulness. It was irresponsibility, a lack of respect for the deceased, and worse, for the family. I paced the room as he talked, the smell of formaldehyde burning my nose, the machine's vibration in the corner like it was logging every second of this mess. The examiner promised he'd fix it immediately, and I hung up trying to pull my thoughts together. The family wanted to see the body whole, and I had an open, empty cavity, exposing an absence that couldn't be seen by anyone. While I waited for the organ to be returned, I mentally rehearsed how I'd reconstruct the area with dignity. Every part of this process carries emotional weight, and when one detail fails, it feels like breaking the trust a family placed in you. It was a crushing sense of responsibility, something most people never consider when they think about mortuary work. The examiner returned about 20 minutes later, carrying the heart in an analysis container. He apologized again, explaining the intern was overwhelmed and panicked when he realized he'd forgotten to document it. I was furious, but kept it to myself. The important thing was fixing this silent chaos before the family arrived. I put my gloves back on, repositioned the light, and began the reconstruction. This is work most people don't understand. It's not just about putting the organ back. There's a deep respect in it, a way of restoring dignity to the body piece by piece, like you're reassembling something that still pulses symbolically. It was a huge responsibility to turn that emptiness back into something whole. As I placed the heart back in its place, I felt the emotional weight of its absence. That organ wasn't just a physical part. It represented the man's entire story, his memories, his life. And it had been left aside, forgotten on a counter because someone didn't fill out a form. I started reconstructing the cavity, layer by layer, closing it carefully. The disinfectant smell mixed with the colder air, creating that sterile hospital atmosphere that always makes it feel like something's watching your every move. Sometimes during the work, I'd swear I heard faint footsteps outside the room, even when no one was there. It might just be your mind playing tricks, but anyone who works with death knows these strange things always surface when the tension rises. Once everything was closed, I cleaned the body, repositioned the arms, and finished with the natural appearance the family expected. But inside, I was drained. The moral weight of that shift had consumed me. It was one of those moments where you question what doing the right thing even means when the protocols fail. I documented everything in the system, detail by detail, timestamp by timestamp, because paperwork is the only protection you have when things spiral out of control. Transparency in this line of work is survival. When the family arrived later that afternoon, the room was quiet. The widow entered first, clutching a tissue, her eyes carrying that exhausted look only someone who's lost a loved one understands. She approached the casket, took a deep breath, and rested her hand on the glass. Then she looked at me with a gratitude I hadn't expected. She said she appreciated that I'd made him whole again. I just nodded, not having the heart to explain what had happened. Sometimes the best gift you can give a family is silence about the chaos you had to fix. When it was all over and I closed the room, I stood there for a while staring at the empty space. The machine was off, the smell still lingering, and the AC's sharp cold gave the room an incomplete feel. I thought about how much of our work happens behind the scenes, how we have to build piece by piece even when no one notices, and how one small mistake can turn everything into a surreal experience of guilt and responsibility. In the end, what stuck with me wasn't the missing heart, but the moral weight left behind in the room's silence, a reminder that every deceased deserves to leave whole, even when the world of the living keeps failing them. Scary stuff. If that one gave you chills too, comment yes down below. I still remember the day I froze in the middle of that cold room, staring at the body, and thought something in there was mimicking me. Not literally, of course, but in a way that left me unsettled. Like the morgue had developed a will of its own and was repeating little signs just to see if I'd notice. It was one of those quiet weeks, that odd transition between winter and spring when the air is still bitter, but the light creeps in a little earlier. Nothing out of the ordinary, just routine cases. The usual smell of formaldehyde mixed with the metallic tang of stainless steel tables. The first body arrived on a Monday night. Middle-aged man, 54, found collapsed in his own garage. Nothing dramatic. The EMTs brought him in with the report already closed. No signs of violence. But the second I lifted the sheet, I knew something was off. On his left chest, just above the rib, there was a horizontal cut. Shallow, precise. Not deep enough to cause serious bleeding, but not accidental either. It was the kind of mark someone would make on purpose, whatever that purpose was. No bruising, no scarring, no inflammation. It looked fresh, but not recent enough to be the cause of death. It was just there, like an unapproved signature. I stared at it longer than I should have. I was alone in that room, the hum of the exhaust fan droning on, the kind of noise that usually puts me on autopilot. But in that moment, something snapped me to attention, like an unseen presence was hovering at the edge of my thoughts. It happens sometimes, especially when the nights get longer and you spend too much time in the quiet. I documented everything, took photos, measured, followed protocol. Just another odd detail. Nothing more. 2 days later, on Wednesday, the second case came in. Another man, different age, different background, found slumped in the back seat of his car. And when I pulled back the sheet, my stomach tightened. The wound was identical. Same spot, same size, same depth. No way it was a coincidence. The cut looked like it had been made by the same tool, the same motion, the same intent. But now, the feeling was different. Like something was being replayed in front of me, like a dark energy was reinforcing a pattern I never asked to see. I took it straight to the pathologist, Dr. Ramsey. He was the most skeptical person I'd ever met. One of those guys who insisted everything had an explanation. Always. But that morning, when he saw the two photos side by side, his expression shifted. Same location, same angle. Zero inflammation in either. The wounds were deliberate but pointless, not deep, not defensive. They didn't do anything. And that was the worst part. They were meaningless. Intentional but meaningless. We dug into everything we could. Medical histories, families, places the two had been. Nothing connected them. One was a truck driver, lived out in the countryside. The other worked in an office downtown. Different ages, different routines, different worlds. There was no logical story tying them together. In the morgue, everything has a cause. It's the kind of place where nothing happens without reason, and when something doesn't fit, the air changes. It's not supernatural in the classic sense, but it's like the routine itself starts sending signals. You begin to notice little echoes, repetitions. Your mind sharpens, searching for patterns. And the more you try to ignore it, the more the whole place seems determined to remind you you're missing something. We cross-referenced the files. Nothing major, just an internal note linking the two cases. No agency requested an investigation, no crime defined, no suspect, no scene, not enough weight to become news or a special report. But I marked it. 2 photos, 2 cuts, 2 bodies that had never met. And that's when the unease started to grow. Not fear exactly, but doubt. You know that feeling when something keeps repeating itself the same way, and you can't shake the sense that it's trying to get your attention? That's how it was. I'd walk into the cold room at night, and for no reason I'd think of the cut. Sometimes while organizing instruments, I'd catch myself pressing my hand to my own left chest, like I was measuring something. The stainless steel table reflected the light strangely, as if the glare insisted on drawing a horizontal line right there, at the same height. It was like those 2 cuts had left their mark on the room, even without any physical force. Symbolic. And I hate it when things in this place try to be symbolic. By Saturday, when the week ended, no other cases with that mark had come in. It was a relief, but not enough. The morgue had gone back to normal, but my mind hadn't. I kept mentally reviewing the photos, like someone trying to decipher a language they only half know. Why would someone make the same mark on 2 completely different people? What was the point of repeating something that left no clear message? In the end, we filed it all away. Protocol demands it. But when I slid the envelope into the metal cabinet, I felt a strange weight in my chest. Not fear, but that sensation of being watched that sometimes lingers when you deal with things too strange to explain. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Weeks passed, then months, and nothing like it ever happened again. No matching wounds, no echo of that cut. Life moved on, cases changed, the city changed seasons. But the truth is, that repetition never left my mind. Every now and then, I wonder if death has a rhythm we don't yet understand. Something that tries to express itself in tiny, almost imperceptible patterns, leaving symbolic marks instead of physical ones. And I wonder if I noticed it by chance, or if it chose to be noticed. The file is still there, buried among countless others. 2 photos, 2 identical signatures carved into 2 different chests. No explanation, no connection, just the lingering sense that something tried to repeat a gesture, and then simply stopped. After this last story about the wound reopening, it's clear these strange little details stick with us long after the shift is over. If you're still watching, take a second to subscribe and keep following these terrifying morgue encounters. Comment, marked again, so I know you made it all the way to the end. And if this video hooked you, leave a like so I can keep bringing you more horror stories just like this. There's another video right here with more chilling tales. Click it and come with me.